Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Beatrice Dupuy, and I'm professor in the departments of French and Italian and Public and Applied Humanities here at the University of Arizona, and I'm also co-director of Circle. Joining me today are Kate Mackay and Xochitl Coronado Vargas from Circle. Before we get started with the webinar, I have a few announcements I would like to make. Circle is housed in the College of Humanities at the University of Arizona and is one of 16 language resources centers funded by the U.S. Department of Education. On this slide, you have the link to Circle's website and the link to the Language Resource Center's general website, where you can find out about the work we all do and access our free resources. Included in this slide are 3 upcoming webinars that will take place in May and June. On May 8th, Natalie Amgott will lead us to consider vlogging abroad as a meaningful practice to engage learners in language learning and cultural reflection. And on May 26th, Manuela Wagner will examine how we can teach language for the purpose of intercultural citizenship or social justice. Our June webinars are all based on Circle projects, and our project directors will be sharing their work with you. 2 webinars, one on June 2nd and the other on June 19th, focus on socioscientific issues in the language classroom. The webinar on June 12th focuses on the use of the multilingual academic corpus of assignments, writing and speech, and how to create digital pedagogical materials using interactive data-driven learning to inductively guide students to discover language patterns. On this slide, we have included the theme of our upcoming 8th Intercultural Competence Conference, which will be held in late January 2022. Disentering mobility in intercultural education, engagement, equity, and access, and our lineup of plenary speakers is right there. The call for papers is out, and the deadline to submit abstracts is June 4th, 2021. You can find additional information at icc.arizona.edu. Today's webinar is based on a Circle project. The presenters of today's webinar are Dr. Sonia Colina and Sarah Albrecht. Sonia is professor of Spanish and director of the National Center for Interpretation at the University of Arizona, where she teaches Spanish linguistics, translation studies, and coordinates the online translation certificate. Last week, she was appointed Regents Professor in recognition of her accomplishments and her work's impact. In her translation studies research, she specializes in applied linguistics and translation, translation quality assessment, pedagogy of translation, and translator education. She's the author of Fundamentals of Translation teaching from research to the classroom, and of numerous articles in edited volumes and translation journals. In addition, she has published on the relationship between translation studies and language teaching. Most recently, she co-authored with Barbara Lafford, Translation in Spanish Language Teaching, the integration of the 5th skill in the second language curriculum, which has appeared in the Journal of Spanish Language Teaching. Her co-presenter, Sarah, is a doctoral candidate in the Language, Reading, and Culture program at the University of Arizona, where she teaches linguistics for pre-service teachers. She's interested in equitable language education and in teaching courses in linguistics, heritage and second language pedagogy, and bilingual education. Her research interests are related. They include pedagogies for combined or separate heritage and second language courses, biliteracy, bilingualism, and bridging the gap between bilingual education in the primary grades and heritage language education in the secondary grades. Her publications about dialect awareness, heritage language teaching, and intercultural competence also reflect these interests, as do collaborations regarding pre-service teacher preparation in bilingual education and this ongoing work on translation. So without further ado, I will leave the virtual floor to Sonia and Sarah now.
First of all, like I said, good afternoon, but I realized that I also should say good morning or good night, because we have people from pretty much all over the world here, just seeing some of the comments in the chat. First, just a few words about the topic. Obviously, we're going to be talking about, I'm going to try to help you understand why it's a good idea to introduce translation into the language classroom. And we're going to give you a little bit of some ideas, some hints on how to do this. So I'm Sonia Colina. One more thing that I wanted to mention, we're going to be taking turns. And so we'll be stopping at a few places throughout the presentation. So one person is going to present and the other one is going to be checking the Q&A for questions. At those stopping points, then we'll try to take care of as many questions as possible. And but if it's not possible to take care of all of them, hopefully we'll have time at the end. Okay, Sarah, you're on now.
Hello, everybody. It's really great to be with all of you here. I was going to say again this afternoon, but whatever your time zone is, thank you for joining us. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with an overview, what our presentation is going to be covering. So if we want to take a look at that, our overview is, our presentation is going to be divided into 4 sections. So we will be looking first at the historical background of the use of translation in language teaching. And then we will move on to why use translation in language teaching. This will include the justification of its use, as well as the roles that translation might play in language teaching. And then we'll move on to how might we do this. This includes steps for implementing translation in your language classroom, and this will be 5 steps. Then we'll move on, once we've talked about steps for implementing translation, then we'll go on to a model activity that could be used in the classroom, and we'll take those 5 steps that we used in the prior section to apply in that model activity. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the historical background of translation in language teaching. So for the past 30 years or so, there have been some scholars dissenting from mainstream second language only methodologies that have urged the use of translation in the world language classroom. Translation has been officially shunned, however, for over a century, but it has been unofficially continued to be used by students and teachers alike during that time. So why has it been unpopular? Well, its unpopularity traces back to the grammar translation method, which is popular through the end of the 19th century. So this method focused almost entirely on teaching grammar and vocabulary to read Greek and Latin texts, or in other words, the goal of language acquisition through the grammar translation method was never for students to be able to speak. Then around the turn of the 20th century, language learning goals started to shift away from communication, or shift, I should say, towards communication, and the method then fell out of favor. When that happened, in the vacuum left by the grammar translation method, various incarnations of the direct method arose. So the direct method is an umbrella term used for any method that does not use students' first language, or L1, as a tool for learning the second language. So what happened is that in a swing of the pendulum against using the first language in the classroom, language learning became characterized by monolingual use of the second language in the classroom. And systematic first language use in language teaching has therefore been out of use, or been out of favor for over a century. Communicative language teaching is among direct method approaches, which do not favor the use of the first language in the classroom. So looking at the third component here on the slide, there are other more recent approaches to language teaching that have moved beyond communicative language teaching. And these look instead to producing language systems as an integrated entity. These approaches include multiliteracies, critical literacies, and cultural and symbolic competence. So the goal, looking at the pedagogy of multiliteracies, the goal of the pedagogy of multiliteracies is to recognize the complexity of students' linguistic and cultural environments. And in doing so, to empower and ultimately give students access to the second language, both at work and in the community. This in turn will help initiate critical engagement in designing their social futures and finding successful, fulfilling employment. It's also been argued that the pedagogy of multiliteracies by its nature requires recognition of social and individual bilingualism in the language classroom. So then by extension, the acceptance of bilingualism also requires the acceptance of the first language and the second language use and translanguaging between language systems. In addition to multiliteracies, these new approaches also include critical literacies and cultural and symbolic competence. So we need to take a quick look at those as well. So critical literacy requires students to look for underlying purposes when they read, to look at sources critically, and to question their own and others' assumptions, and to be able to transform new information. So critical literacy also encourages students to read like writers and to think about their own and others' language choices. The third approach is cultural and symbolic competence. So multilingual communicators also show symbolic competence through their ability to manipulate more than one linguistic code. And this moves them beyond traditional communicative competence in the target language. So what is symbolic competence? Symbolic competence is the ability to manipulate the three dimensions of language as a symbolic system. And this includes symbolic representation, symbolic action, and symbolic power. So as speakers, we name, and this is symbolic representation. We do, and this is symbolic action. And we construct or reconstruct social realities, and this is symbolic power. So if we move on to the next slide, then we can see some reasons why for only using the second language in the classroom. So reasons why there may be some focus on staying only in the second language. However, translation as a pedagogy requires the use of the first language. So issues with avoiding the first language in the classroom need to be considered. So these concerns might include that the goal of language acquisition is coordinate bilingualism. And with coordinate bilingualism, that means that students have two completely separate language systems. It might also mean that there's a belief that students should acquire the second language the same way that they acquire the first language. That is, that they're acquiring it monolingually. And this might be, reasons might also include the belief that students can acquire the second language better by hearing more of the second language and less of the first language. So we are going to take a brief pause here. And as we go on to the next slide, you can see that we have a poll for you as participants to take, with the question being, do you use L1 in your classroom? In the sense of, do you use L1 as part of your teaching strategy in your classroom? With the converse being, do you avoid the use of L1 in your classroom? We've got about 3/4 of our respondents saying yes to L1 use in the classroom, and no, 1/4 of the respondents saying no. So kind of keeping our results in mind, let's take a look at reasons for using the L1 and kind of keeping in mind your own responses and maybe your own reasons for using L1, and maybe seeing how they align with reasons or making a case for using the L1 in the language classroom. So while there, what we were talking about before, arguments against using the L1 in the classroom, these can be countered, and a positive case can be made for the use of the first language in the classroom, which we'll talk about on this slide here. So some of the reasons in favor of using the first language in the classroom can include that it has been argued that both students and teachers use the first language in the classroom under the table. So the first language use should instead, according to Cook, be deliberate and systematic. So if first language use is going to be used, if the first language is going to be used in the classroom, then let's make it deliberate and systematic. Let's make it planned. Some scholars find it unrealistic to avoid the use of L1 in the classroom, since teachers and learners use translation covertly anyway, particularly while teachers overtly use communicative language teaching. So since it's unavoidable, informed and responsible use of the L1 is a better strategy than ignoring its existence. The second reason that deliberate use of the first language can help students be more aware of their languages, take pride in being bilingual, and interlink the first language and second language knowledge in their minds. This relates directly to the next point, which is that a bilingual is not the sum of two monolinguals, that instead the two languages can be looked at as an integrated entity. So it's a common misperception to think of bilinguals as monolingual speakers of two separate languages. So it's also a misperception to think the goal of classroom instruction is to produce speakers with native-like monolingual competence in the second language. Even being a balanced bilingual speaker of two languages or a speaker with equal proficiency in two languages is not the same thing as being a monolingual speaker of two languages put together in one person. Instead, what the goal is to approach students' languages as one unified system. By using both the first language and the second language in the classroom, students learn how to use two language systems as genuine second language users as opposed to monolingual natives. So that in turn leads to our final point, which is that of translanguaging skills for life. So these linked linguistic systems help with translanguaging skills for real life use when students are using two languages simultaneously. So this brings us to the end of our section on the historical background of the use of translation in language teaching. And this has brought us from the fall of the grammar translation method to the direct method to approaches such as multiliteracies, critical literacies, and symbolic competence, reasons for reluctance to use the L1 in the language classroom, and the case for its use. So we'll stop here for a minute and see if there are any questions about the background of language of translation in language teaching.
Yes, I think we have one question, was actually a comment that is very related to the topic that you just finished your section with, having to do with the bilingual, a bilingual not being the sum of two monolinguals. I'm just going to read the comment. It's a comment and expands on that in an interesting way from the point of view of the audience. This is just a comment. I very much appreciated the reference in chapter 1 of your ebook to a redefinition of bilingualism. That is the goal of classroom instruction is not to produce native speakers. This was a huge realization for me as a learner that I only noticed after I had been teaching for a few years. Our students need to understand how broad the definition of bilingualism is, and that their goal is not to necessarily sound like a native speaker, but to communicate. I think this understanding will then inform the methodologies we choose. Thank you so much for sharing the book. I found it so helpful and informative. Okay, so this is a very nice comment. Thank you. And also the book, we will be referring to it later. So you should have gotten already a link for it since we talked about that. But anyway, so yes, that's just a comment about what we were just talking about. And we'll mention it's a nice segue into the next section. We have one more question. I think we might be able to answer this one quickly. Please define translanguaging. That's the question. I don't know if you want to try that, Sarah, since you were talking about this section.
Sure, I'll go ahead and do that. And then if you have anything else, Dr. Colina, that you want to add in, then feel free. So basically, when we were talking about using two languages as a unified system, so taking the first language and the second language and being able to, in the student's mind, being able to move easily between the first language and the second language and combine those two languages as one system, that would be translanguaging. So that's basically the term for doing that.
All right. Oh, there's another question about code switch, and we'll keep that one for late. Well, let me just go ahead real quickly. Code switch, and the difference is that you're in the middle, sometimes in the middle of a conversation or an utterance or a sentence, and then you go from one language to another. So you continue the conversation or the speech act or whatever it is that's happening at that point in the other language, and it can happen a number of times. So I'm hoping that that answers the question. So if I'm now speaking in English and all of a sudden I continue with my conversation in Spanish and then I stop and I go back to English, that's code switching. Now that we've looked at the background a little bit and the historical background, we're going to just answer a couple of questions about the rationale of why use translation, what are the benefits? So overall, we'll be briefly talking about multilingual and cultural benefits, literacy benefits, linguistic benefits, and benefits for heritage speakers. Obviously, there are more than these, but we'll just focus on those and give you a little bit of an introduction or a few thoughts about each one of those. First of all, multilingual and multicultural benefits. Some of these we've already mentioned. The goal of language teaching should be not native speakerism, not trying to reproduce and create native speakers in each one of those languages, but the ability to move comfortably between languages. And it's pretty obvious that translation helps with that. It helps us use two languages and not simultaneously, obviously we're not, well, unless we do interpreting, but go from one into the other. Also, translation allows for border crossing and border dissolvent. So we cross the borders, but we also reach out to the other linguistic side and dissolve those borders, make it easier. It allows for working with more than one culture and for noticing similarities and differences. Literacy benefits. First of all, reading comprehension of the source text. In order to translate, it is important to understand the source text in detail and clearly. So it helps and focuses on reading comprehension. Also writing, that's an important element. Sometimes writing can be a little bit overwhelming for the students. So translation can be seen as an aided writing activity. What do I mean by this? I mean that it's easier for a student to put aside the worry of having to come up with new ideas, having to organize those ideas and be able to focus on the language. And by language, I don't mean just the structure, but I also mean how we organize those ideas in a text, right? So then translation helps them with that. It helps them with organization and decision making. And I'm thinking about, and I'm talking about a type of translation which also considers different textual structures and rhetorical organization in the languages, that it doesn't necessarily imply transferring the way a text is structured in the source language to the target language. And finally, in terms of literacy benefits, translation is also useful in the transform practice components of the multiliteracies model, because it allows us to apply knowledge in real world situations. It's not a coincidence that many cases when we have students do internships and do service learning, translation is one of the activities that's most popular because it's a way to apply their language knowledge in a real world situation. It also helps us make new meaning and transform prior knowledge. In terms of linguistic benefits, first of all, there's metalinguistic awareness. Translation forces to look at the structure of both languages and think about them. It also helps seeing and understanding the linguistic system as a whole versus discrete parts. With translation, we don't focus just on a certain verbal form or a certain syntactical structure, but we need to look at a whole text or even a whole sentence, and that includes all aspects of structure, of meaning, syntax. And finally, in terms of vocabulary, translation is helpful through noticing differences, noticing what slight nuances of meaning words have. And it also forces the students to come up with different types of output, what we call pushed output. Students sometimes are very good at finding ways to work around certain issues when they don't know the structure. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a pretty good strategy for language learners, but sometimes they can manage really well to avoid certain structures that they don't know, or even words, right? So then translation helps them with that. And it also helps create greater involvement in student tasks. And finally, the last category of benefits that we're talking about here has to do with the benefits for heritage speakers. Translation allows for heritage speakers to connect with their personal experiences. Many heritage speakers, especially in the United States, and I'm sure in other countries that have similar situations, similar linguistic and social linguistic situations, have had to help their families as translators and interpreters. They're the first generation of speakers that know both languages, the L1 and the L2 really well. So they've had to help the monolingual speakers in their community. Translation helps them connect with that experience that they bring into the classroom. It also helps with critical language awareness, with an understanding of social linguistics and social political goals, what goals the language plays in a specific social linguistic and a social political situation, and it helps with linguistic skills. And finally, for heritage speakers, it's important because translation helps them acquire, learn additional dialects, switch registers, and it also helps normalize the practices of heritage language learners that I was referring to earlier, like interpreting and translating, that sometimes are seen as something that's undervalued. Translation can help them realize the value that there is in those skills and normalize those practices.
Let's see. Okay, there we go. We have a question. Can you clarify what you mean by pushed output?
Yes. Students sometimes, when we only have them speak in the second language, they may now know a certain type of structure. For instance, maybe they don't know how to use the subjunctive. I'm thinking in terms of Spanish, right? If we have an L1, a student who's an L1 in English but's trying to learn Spanish, or other languages that use the subjunctive, they may find other ways to express what they want to express without the construction that requires a subjunctive that they're not sure about. Right? So they can find their ways around something. If this is a translation, they have a certain structure that maybe we came up with to force them to come up with a subjunctive. And they can't, I mean, maybe it's not impossible, but it's a little harder to get around that. So that's where we can push certain structures and force them to produce them. I hope that was clear enough.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions here dealing with translanguaging. So the first one is asking if in this webinar, we are presenting the benefits of translation in the classroom or the benefits of translanguaging. And the second one is related, which is what is the difference between translation and translanguaging?
Okay, so I'll start with the second one, starting with the differences. Translanguaging does not imply translation. We can be moving in and out of languages. For instance, talking about different content. Code switching is a type of translanguaging, right? When we translate, we have the same text that has been expressed in one language, and now we put it into another language. So it's sort of a repetition of the same text in different terms and in a different language, but we're not moving ahead in the conversation in the same way that we would do with translanguaging. Translanguaging, it's a broader term. Okay? So translation is a little bit more specific. If I say something in target language A, and my classmate right next to me did not understand that, then that person could translate it and say it in another language, so that, or I could do it for that classmate to help them understand that, to repeat the same thing. And I'm sorry, can you remind me of the other question, Sarah?
The other question was if we, in the webinar, if we're presenting benefits of translation in the classroom or benefits of translanguaging.
Okay, so in that sense, we're actually talking about benefits of translation in the classroom, and we'll give some examples, and I think that will become clear. But again, as translanguaging is a broader term, then you could say, well, in a way it's included there, right? Translation could be a form of translanguaging because we're, in a broader sense, we're talking about both languages, but we will be more specific and talk about the process in which one text in one language is transferred, the exact same text. Well, sometimes it could be a little different, but we're focusing on that text and now putting it into another language.
So our next section is on how to implement translation into the language classroom. So we have 5 steps. So our first step is to determine what your students can do. So that's primarily looking at what language level are they at. And once you have taken a look at what level your students are at, then that will, of course, determine what kind of translation activities you can try to incorporate into your classroom. The second step is to determine if you have content already that you're using in your classroom that you can build around. And we've already had reference to the companion handbook that we have with our presentation today. And so that could be one resource for determining if you have content to build around. So you can look at translation activities that have already been created and then look at the content that you already have in your classroom to see if there's something that's already been created as far as a translation activity. Does that match up with something you're already doing in your classroom? And then is there something that you could do to put those two together? And then our third step is to determine goals and or objectives in what you want to accomplish. And then the fourth is to plan your activity. And the fifth is to assess and reflect. So we can take a look in a little bit more depth. So step 1 is to determine the kind of activity that is best for your students' level. Adaptation, keeping in mind that adaptation is possible when you're taking a look at what kind of translation activity that you're interested in doing. For example, you might scaffold the vocabulary that you give the students, or if they're a little bit more advanced, you might have them have a word bank. You might have them be looking words up. So those, as far as vocabulary goes with the translation activity, those are some possible adaptations or modifications that you might use. And again, in the companion handbook to this presentation, there are suggestions for adaptations. Okay, step 2, to determine if you have content to build around. So I already talked a little bit about that as far as looking at what you're already doing in your classroom, because of course, it's always easier if you have something that you're doing and then you can just add a little bit more in rather than starting from the ground up, because everybody is busy. Sometimes that can be kind of overwhelming to add something new in. So what are you already doing that you can just simply add something new to? Now, we've already talked about the multiliteracy's approach as paving the way, or opening one of the approaches that has opened the way for translation to make a return to the language classroom. So if we're looking at a multiliteracy's framework, the transformed practice prong in the multiliteracy's framework would come as a follow-up, might come as a follow-up activity. So for example, if you're using situated practice, so maybe you've had a writing activity or a reading activity, and you've gone into depth with those, then translating that activity would be an example of transformed practice. All right, step 3, to determine goals and objectives. All right, so these possible goals and objectives look very much like the justification for using translation in the language classroom. So these are all research-based outcomes of the uses of translation in the language classroom. So you can determine what kind of goals or what you have for using translation in your classroom, and then what kind of objectives do you have? So is it some type of linguistic learning? Is it cultural learning? Or, and of course, any combination of these. What kind of, is there a literacy learning that you want to have taking place? Do you want to have students, again, here's translanguaging coming up again, translanguaging taking place, working with the negotiation of meaning. Are you working with heritage language students? Are you wanting to be focusing on heritage language learning? And just a final point there down at the bottom of the slide, that if you use actful can-do statements to create objectives in your classrooms. Just a point that actful can-do statements are a possible starting point, and then you can use those to narrow down your objectives, and they can be modified to suit what you're doing with your translation goals and objectives. And also there are some sample ideas in the handbook of how can-do statements might be modified for translation activities. Okay, step 4 is to then plan your activity. So if this is one of your first translation activities, you might want to take as your point of departure an example in published works such as Colina and Laford, Gonzalez Davies, Carreras, and as previously mentioned, we have some examples in the handbook, and then modify it according to your needs, according to your learners' levels, according to what you're already doing in your classroom. And then, like it says there, most translation activities can be modified according to your learners' levels, what you're doing in your classroom. And our final step is to assess and reflect. So translation products can serve as your learning assessments. You can do formative assessments while your students are working, but then the translation products that your students produce can serve as learning assessments. So for example, if they are creating a survey, then you can have them, that they do in their 2 languages, then you can have them turn in the survey and you can see what their work is. You can have them create a poster. So there are various types of final products, translated products, that you can have students turn in for an assessment. So as far as reflection, this is kind of multifaceted as far as what you might do with reflection. So you can look at reflection simply logistically. How was your timing? How did your instructions go? Did students understand what they were supposed to be doing? Do you need, when you do this again, do you need to clarify anything or modify anything? But then also, what kinds of learning were taking place? And this is a kind of reflection that you can involve your students in. So, and you can go back and look at the goals and objectives, where your goals and objectives met, and again, students can be involved in this discussion, and some really interesting responses can come out from your students. Did they learn anything that was new? Were they involved in any thought processes that maybe they were different than when in the classroom, in the normally structured classroom? So what was different about being engaged in a translation activity? And so this is the kind of reflection that you yourself can engage in, as well as your students. So we can see if there are any questions about these 5 steps. Although the next section in which we will talk about a lesson plan will specifically incorporate these 5 steps. So what do these look like in the context of a lesson plan? So just putting that out there. But we can take a minute here in case there are any questions.
Yes, we have, I think we have 2 questions. The first one is, wouldn't the use of translation take us back to the classic grammar translation method? How effective is the use of translation for students' communicative abilities? And this is a great question. This is a point that we're going to try to make here. Yes, it could be dangerous to use translation if you don't do it in an informed manner. People could fall back on grammar translation. Sure. This is why we think it is important to be aware and to learn and to train people about all the things that we've been talking about, to make decisions about what your objectives are, to try to figure out how you're going to use translation in a way that is beneficial to language learning. And of course, that's easy to say. So we need to show you some examples and see how that works. But just to very briefly, just give you an example of how translation is or could be a great communicative ability or skill in addition to what we'll do here. If you think about professional translation, or even if it's not professional, but we're talking about what a lot of heritage speakers do for their families, what more communicative activity could you have really than that? What you're trying to do is communicate with an audience that does not know the target language. So it all depends on how you use it. Translation per se could be, there's a lot of communication involved, not so much in grammar translation. So that's why it's important to provide guidelines and so that the use of translation can be informed. So now we're going to then move on to, there's nothing else, to the final section, which is the lesson plan. We're going to walk you through a lesson plan. And but before we start doing that, before going through the sample, we want you to start thinking, not before, but actually as we go through that lesson plan and that example, start thinking about your context, your situation. What ideas do you have to apply this to your group of students, to your situation? So we have created a Google Doc where you can start typing that, and that will allow us to share all your ideas and everyone to see them. So as we, like I said, as we walk through this, start thinking and start coming up with new ideas. And we'll talk about this at the end, and we'll try to look at them and see what we can gather from everyone's ideas. All right, lesson plan. Here's a model lesson plan that has to do with proverbs. Okay, first of all, let me give you a little bit of a summary of what this entails. We will provide a list of proverbs in English and in the second language. Then also we'll design a match activity in which the students find either the English or the second language proverb that corresponds to the one that was provided. And then we will have the students comment on the differences, in particular cultural differences. And this is an example of an activity, a lesson plan that Sarah implemented in her high school class. So you'll see references to English and Spanish because those were the languages in that situation. But please, every time we talk about Spanish, just replace that with whatever your language is, or just simply the second language. Step one, as we've seen in the previous section, we need to determine what the students can do. As I said, in this specific case, this particular lesson plan, this was done in the US context, in a high school, in an English-Spanish situation. So for anyone in a similar situation where we have intermediate high school students in the US, no major modifications should be needed. There might be some modifications. There's always no context is exactly the same as another, but it should not be anything major. However, modifications may be necessary for other types of students in context, and we'll suggest a couple of modifications as we move along through this example. So that's in terms of what the students can do. Also, it's important in step one to determine if you as a teacher already have content that you can build around. This is obviously the best case scenario in which you don't have to come up with something completely new. The model of the lesson having to do with proverbs that we're going to show here, for instance, could be incorporated easily in lessons that have a linguistic or a cultural content. For instance, a fable unit. For looking at fables, we're going to have proverbs. We're going to have the moral of the story. So it could be really, it could go well with that. There could be many different things that you can think of or that you have specific to your context, but it's good to think about if there's something that you can build around instead of having to create something from scratch. Sometimes school districts have lesson plans and have units that you have to cover. So look at all the ones that you have and see if there's any that fit well with this, with proverbs. Goals, step 3. There was a question in the chat, and I'll refer to it because it's relevant here that I answered. I typed the answer that had to do, well, is translation direct translation or reverse translation, right? Going into the L1 or the L2, is that better or worse for language acquisition? And my answer was that it has to do with your goals, right? So depending on what it is that you want to do, you might want to decide to do different things. So one way to approach setting your objectives or your goals for these activities is to determine, first of all, what learning objectives you want to meet with a translation activity. And then you can combine them with, in the case of the US, with the ACTFL proficiency standards or other standards that might be relevant to your country. It's also a good idea to consider the proposed roles that translation can serve in language learning that Sarah referred to earlier, and that Colina and Lafford proposed in 2017. For instance, roles such as linguistic or cultural awareness. So if you can combine all of those, right, then that will give you an idea as far as what your goals or objectives might be. In our example in particular, we determined that the primary translation focus of this activity will be cultural. So cultural learning as a translation goal was overlaid onto the intermediate mid-ACTFL proficiency standards for interpersonal communication, as well as the can-do statements. So when we did that, these are, I'm sorry, I think I skipped one. Yes, here we go. These are the goals or objectives that we came up with. So objectives, students will use translation to be able to identify the underlying message in Spanish proverbs. Students will be able to explain how proverbs are related to cultural perspectives, and students will use translation to be able to use proverbs in English and Spanish to make cultural comparisons. Now, if we translate those into standards, then we have, I can identify the underlying message in Spanish proverbs. In my own and other cultures, I can explain how proverbs are related to cultural perspectives, and I can use proverbs in English and Spanish to make cultural comparisons. They could be, in our case, we were talking about cultural awareness, cultural knowledge, cultural comparisons, but there could be other goals or objectives that might be helpful for your situation. For instance, we can have linguistic awareness as a goal in which we compare the linguistic structure, the linguistic forms of the proverbs. So if you're more interested in the language structure, so then you can compare the proverbs and see how they differ in the two languages. Another objective could be literacy. You might be interested in having students learn about what genres use proverbs. We mentioned a fable earlier, but it could be others. Or you might be interested in teaching students about how different cultures and different linguistic communities use proverbs in interaction. Which ones use more proverbs? Which ones maybe use fewer? When do they use them? Do people, when they're in conversation, throw in proverbs? So this might be some additional objectives that you might want to consider in addition to cultural awareness. And we talked about modifications earlier. A couple of examples, we said that our context was intermediate high school students in the US, but what happens if we have more advanced students than that? What happens if we have students that are less advanced? Well, in the case of less advanced students, we could provide them with vocabulary lists. Maybe they don't know a lot of the terms that are in those proverbs, so we can help them a little bit by providing those lists. What if there's students that are more advanced, perhaps maybe college students? Well, then we could ask them to come up with alternative forms of the same proverb. Maybe these are students that belong to different linguistic communities and can say, okay, how could you express the same meaning? Do you have different proverbs? Or instead of, we're going to see, we mentioned that we're going to give them lists, right? Instead of giving them the list for them to match the proverbs, we can ask them to come up with their own lists. So there are ways of making it a little more challenging. Step 4, plan the activity. So how do we actually do this? Once we've determined that we have content to build around, there are students already, that we know what our goals are, how do we do it? Well, we first start coming up with the materials. What is it that we're going to need? Our ingredients, for our lesson plan. In this case, and in this example, we needed 2 lists of proverbs, one in English and one in Spanish. Like I said, it could be, any other language. And we cut each list apart and provided one set of each to each group. And then the second material that we used was a worksheet, right? And the worksheet we'll see in a second, but included a list of proverbs, a literal translation, English equivalent, and cultural comparison. So here's the list of proverbs. That on the left we have the English, obviously, and then Spanish on the right. And here's the worksheet that I was referring to. So the worksheet will have the proverb in the second language, the first column, then the translation, meaning, and cultural comparison. Okay, these are the materials. We're going to talk about them in a little more detail now. All right, so before you get started, you'll have your materials ready. When we're already in the classroom, what will be the procedure? Well, it's always good to start with prior knowledge and activating prior knowledge. And we can start with questions like the following. What do you think of when you hear the word proverb? So we get the students thinking about proverbs. Think about 2 or 3 proverbs in English or whatever their native language might be. What do they mean? How do you often use them in everyday life? So we get them thinking about this, and this could be a whole class discussion, or we could do it in groups. And finally, we tell students that they will be doing a translation activity in which they compare a set of proverbs in Spanish with a set of proverbs in English. Again, whatever the 2 languages may be. And we list the objectives of the activity on the board or on a computer screen if we're teaching online, so that students know what it is that they're supposed to accomplish. Okay, the next step, once we kind of warm them up a little bit and get them thinking about the topic, is that we will give the students the worksheet with a list of proverbs in Spanish, the one we just saw a little while ago. I'll show it to you again, right? So we'll give them the worksheet with a list of proverbs in Spanish and have them do the following. First, skim the proverbs, the list of proverbs that they have on the far column on the left, and they can ask about words that they do not know. In groups of 3 or 4, then we have them directly translate the proverbs and write the translations in the middle column. So this would be here, right, where we say translation. We ask them to translate them directly. We'll see that in most cases, the students are going to come up with very direct, literal translations. In the last column, we ask them, I'm sorry, I think I skipped something. No, okay, I'm okay. Directly translate the proverbs and write the translations in the middle column. In the last column, then we'll ask them to write in English what they think that the proverb means. So in a way, we're basically asking them to guess at the actual meaning of that proverb in this column here that says meaning. Okay. All right, so now that we've had them do that, now we go back to the cut up list of the English proverbs and the Spanish proverbs, and we ask the students to try to match them. Okay? So these are 2 separate lists. Now try to match in which proverb in English corresponds to the one in Spanish and vice versa. And the matching could be actually made into a competition to see who can do it faster. Students tend to enjoy doing this. Okay, so here is the list, the 2 separate lists. Once we've had them do this, it's a good idea to introduce literal and functional translations to the class. The idea that the concept of translations, they're literal, that reflect the structure of the source text, and translations that don't necessarily reflect the structure of the source text, but they can work in the same way as that source text, that original text, right? So in our worksheet here, we'd ask them to come up with a direct translation. This would be a literal translation. And when we ask them, well, what do you think this means in the meaning column, this would be the functional translation. So we asked the students which translations are literal and which ones are functional. Okay? So hopefully they'll come up with an answer similar to what I just said. And we asked them also, what does this say to you about different types of translation? So in this case, we're having them focus on different types of translation, different ways of translating. In the next activity, we have students write the English proverb next to the Spanish proverb on the cultural comparison sheet. That's the last column on the worksheet. And in their groups, we ask them to discuss the following. What are cultural similarities and differences between the proverbs? And we ask them also to take notes on the worksheet. So right here, then we say, okay, here, write the English. Once you've matched them, and now you know what the English and the Spanish are, write the English and compare them, right? So once they've done that, we would ask them to discuss the cultural comparisons as a class. So we would have a classroom, whole class discussion here, thinking about those cultural comparisons. And finally, just to conclude the closure of this lesson plan would be, well, to have them think, and then again, a whole class discussion in which the students would answer, how do proverbs represent cultural perspectives? So we take them from the actual comparison to a broader level of cultural perspectives. And finally, the last section and last step in our steps would be assess and reflect. First, about assessing. It's always good to go back and think about, okay, did these students accomplish the objectives that we meant that we had for this lesson, right? So we could have a formal assessment in which we assess the objectives of cultural learning. And those would be, if we were to go back to our standards, identify the underlying message in Spanish proverbs, explain how proverbs are related to cultural perspectives, use proverbs in English and Spanish to make cultural comparisons, right? It's also, in addition to a formal assessment, don't forget that it's also important to check for understanding while we're carrying out the activity by circulating around the classroom and listening to the students' conversations. Okay. Then, in terms of formal assessment, then how do we assess that the objectives have been met? So one way in which we did this, an example, is we had students choose a matching set of proverbs in English and in Spanish. So here now we have a new set of proverbs. And we asked them to write out and illustrate the proverbs on a poster. In the second step, they could do it in English or in Spanish. We would ask them to explain what the cultural similarities or differences are between those proverbs that now they selected and wrote out on the poster. And this thing is something that they could do on the front or back of the same poster or in a different submission. So this could be homework that they have to do separately. It could be a writing assignment. And finally, we reflect on how the lesson plan went. Some ideas for this type of reflection are, how did your directions and explanations go? Were they clear? Did the students understand? How was the timing? Did it take too long or too short of an activity? Did you meet your objectives? Why or why not? An example of some reflections in regard to objectives are, well, objectives were met. Students translated the proverbs without difficulty and made interesting insights and comparisons both on language and culture. It could be that maybe we find that objectives were not all met. Students translated perhaps the proverbs without difficulty, but some of the insights and comparisons maybe show that they didn't quite understand some of the differences, right? So that would be something that we need to go back over. What went well? what could you have done differently? For instance, in our case, the matching activity ended up being it could have been a little more challenging for the particular set of students that we had that included a lot of heritage speakers. Another point of reflection, did you accomplish anything through translation that you may not have otherwise? Did anything come up that you had not thought of and that was beneficial? For instance, the activity prompted interesting discussions between heritage and non-heritage speakers, especially on the cultural level. Something else that just comes to mind is, well, maybe the students also learn about functional and non-functional or literal translations, and they perhaps engage with that type of discussion more than we would have thought. That's another example in terms of reflection. Okay, so before we move on to questions, and in this case, I think we have ample time, so we'll be able to answer questions to this section or also questions that have to do with the entire presentation. But before we do that, we'd like to conclude by saying that translation can be highly beneficial for language learning if used in an informed manner. It is important, like we said earlier, that we do it in a way that it's informed, that has objectives, that helps us reflect and think about whether we achieve those objectives, so that it does not become grammar translation again, and make sure that our objectives are different. So we have done this, we've provided some guidelines and some examples on how to incorporate translation in the world language classroom. You have received the ebook, and we will also have a URL for those who you may have missed it. In there, and you'll find more activities and information in the ebook, which you also refer to as the teacher's guide. So we'll stop here for questions and then move on to talking about your ideas and going back to the Google Doc.
Yes, we do have a few questions in the Q&A. So I think let's go ahead and start with a couple that both have to do with when and how you're using the L1 and the L2. So the first one is basically, are the class discussions in the L1 or the L2 target?
Okay, that's very good. In our case, if I remember correctly, Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a lot of L1, but there was also some L2, right? But we were not, there was no hard and fast rule as far as you have to use only the L2. Anything to add to that, since you were more involved with it?
Yes, I would say yes, that's pretty much the way it was. I think also how much you're using the L1 versus the L2 might also depend on the level that your students are at, but there was not a hard and fast rule as far as whether the explanations were in L1 or L2.
I'm going to add that, I mean, that is also very typical. We're talking about a multilingual classroom, the benefits of multilingualism or translanguaging. So that's an example of that, when the classroom discussion, right, happens in both languages. So, you know, it's beneficial in that sense for language learning in general, independently of translation.
Okay, so the second question that I was going to pair with this first one that has to do with L1 and L2 was going back to step 4. And the question was specifically, are you doing this in the first language or the second language? So this was going back to discussing the implementation of this lesson plan.
Can you clarify a little bit more? Is the L1 or the L2 actually the way the activities are written, or the discussion in the classroom?
So I think that this was on slide 34. And So I think that what this was when we had the proverb in the target language, and then the translation was going into the L1.
Yes. Mhm.
Yeah. Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
going to the L1. Depending on the level of your students, you may want to do it in the other direction too. You know, that has to do again with level expectations and what your goals might be. So there's a lot of flexibility in that sense, in that regard. No hard and fast rule. Yeah.
Right. How you might be an example of how you might modify that depending on your own learners in your own classroom.
Exactly.
Okay, so another one, do the facilitators suggest writing translations on vocabulary lists?
That's a very good question. I wouldn't suggest it in general. I mean, don't get them used to the easy way all the time. Now, it might be helpful in a few cases, right? Where we're adjusting, we're making modifications because a certain activity might be difficult for the students, so we can provide them some translations. But I would not do it in general, as a rule, because then we go back to always being dependent on the L1 for vocabulary excessively. And there's the risk of introducing grammar translation right back in.
Here's one that's asking about using nursery rhymes. So nursery rhymes in children's storybooks is one that I'm struggling with in translation. Do you have any tips?
That's another interesting question, because nursery rhymes are very different, right? So we could, I would suggest coming up with something similar, right? In some cases, you may find something that is closer depending on the cultures and the languages that you're talking about. And in some other cases, you might not have the same thing at all. But again, we're talking about comparisons, right? And similarities and differences. So in that case, the fact that you're discussing that, talking about a situation where there's nothing similar, or where there is something somewhat similar, but a little bit still different. So then that allows you to make these comparisons about the culture and certain types of nursery rhymes that might happen in one culture and not the other. If they're similar, you can look at the specifics of the language. For instance, well, maybe that's not a good example. I'll leave it at that.
So this one's about working in a multilingual classroom instead of a bilingual classroom. So the question is, I'm currently teaching an Intro to Translation Studies course to students studying Arabic, Turkish, Persian, French, Urdu, and Romanian. Of these languages, I know only 2 of them. So I'm looking for good reference books for translation activities that will work in a multilingual classroom in which the instructor cannot evaluate accuracy, but rather wants to help students expand their thinking about approaches to translation. Can you recommend any sources?
Well, I would mention one that I feel a little bit embarrassed because it's my own book, is Fundamentals of Translation. It's more on the translation side than the language teaching, but there's a number of activities that will give the students an idea about what translation in a professional sense, in a communicative sense, is about versus grammar translation. And there are sections that talk about different types of translation and different degrees of correspondence with the source. So that would be one that I can think of. Unfortunately, what happens is that a lot of the translation textbooks are quite language specific. And there are good reasons for that. So sometimes I might recommend, even if someone is interested in a different language, to still look at a book that is for another language that's not relevant. Because it'll give them an idea of what to do, even if the examples are not very clear to them in terms, not clear, but not very relevant, and they can't quite duplicate the same example. If there are no more questions, then we can look at the Google Doc, right? And hopefully they have been including some ideas there. I'm just going to read a few because I don't want to just start reading to myself, right? So I'll read them out loud and see. Okay. This I will do in my future master class. I used a translation activity in Spanish as a heritage language class. My goal was that students could develop their critical language awareness. We worked with contexts in which students would have to translate words such as carpet, usually inappropriately referred to as falsos amigos. Translation tends to be pictured in very prescriptivist terms. And my point was that students understood that the variety they bring from home may be the best choice when translating for their community, for example. Exactly, that's an excellent point. And it's a way also in which translation activities in the introduction of translation in language teaching, heritage language teaching can be very valuable. When we translate, we have to consider who we're translating for, right? And the goal of that translation. So if the translation is for a specific community, those members of that same community, the heritage language community, will probably be the ones creating the community that, the translation that works the best for them. So it's not all about translations that are in really highly formal, prestigious forms of the language, but in many cases, those students will be the ones able to produce the best translation for that audience. And this is important, that their variety to bring from home may be the best choice. Okay, this was in the past, so I will keep thinking for the future. Every February around Valentine's Day, I used to do a small unit on piropos with my sophomore Spanish 2 students. That was very similar to the Proverbs lesson here. It was a wonderful way to incorporate so much cultural information, have some fun with the language during a festive time, as well as all the other linguistic and translanguaging benefits discussed here. It's a very interesting idea. Yeah, Sarah, do you have as a high school teacher anything to add or comment on?
Well, I would just add in my agreement as far as the multiple benefits that can happen with doing a translation lesson. And just to encourage, it looks like many people have tried this, but to encourage just giving it a try and seeing how many different kinds of benefits that you can find by incorporating one of these carefully planned lessons in, where you can find cultural information, having fun with the language, having linguistic benefits, literacy benefits, and new kinds of conversations about the language that you've never had before. Students thinking about the language, thinking about the culture in ways that they never have before.
Here we have another comment. It's possible in crash course and beginning language levels. So I take that to mean that this type of activity, it's easier for a short course and for beginning language levels. Yes, definitely this was a lesson plan that we used, as I said, in an intermediate high school class. But like we said, this could be this particular activity or another one. We can still use translation for more advanced courses. And the next comment refers to that exactly. I am planning on teaching a course around an oral history interview in the fall, in which the students will translate it throughout the semester as a group project. This current semester, my students have transcribed the interview, and we will be using the transcription as the base from which the new set of students can translate. I'm very interested in translation and transcription in the language classroom in coordination with oral history. So this is clearly a more advanced class, but this is something that we can also do with translation, which is actually very communicative, but it also brings in aspects of culture, history, heritage, language teaching, and all of those elements. So this is really, we have 5 pages of comments here. This is very interesting. Thank you everyone for being so engaged. The next comment, and we may have 5 minutes, or maybe I'll be able to get through the second page, but then we'll have these comments and talk about them and be able hopefully get back to you with a comment or response if it's a question. Anyway, the next one is I have been teaching Spanish for medical careers with focus on interpretation and translation. So this is something we use on a daily basis. In addition, I use translation as a technique in my AP Spanish language and Spanish for native speakers classes. Because even though they're speakers of the language, many have said it helps them with their English. Yes, this is exactly one of the goals that we are talking about. Metalinguistic awareness of the structure of the languages, and not necessarily always the second language, but sometimes the first language too. So excellent comment. Another one. I taught an advanced language course focused on Turkish cinema, and we experimented with subtitling and dubbing of short film clips. Yes, this is a great area that students just love. I taught my students to use subtitling software, and they worked in pairs on subtitling and then assessing each other's work. At the end of the course, they subtitled an entire feature Turkish language film in English, and we screened it on campus for a non-Turkish speaking audience. The feature film subtitling project took place in steps. First, pairs translated their segment of the film in Google Docs. They revised based on peer instructor feedback. Then in larger groups, we started putting the segments together and had class arguments about recurrent phrases or difficult to translate idioms and or other usages of the language, voting on English equivalents that would then be used throughout the film. The subtitling process already really improved my students' listening skills, especially when they had to place each subtitle in the software track, matching it to the original audio. They found this real world use of their language skills to be really satisfying. Exactly. The students get generally really involved. Again, real world use of their language skills. This is a perfect example also of a communicative skill, a communicative activity, right? What more communicative than trying to subtitle something for audiences that don't understand the original track. In addition, just like this audience member commented, Jeanette, we have a number of different skills. There's listening skills, there's reading, there's also subtitling, technical knowledge that students really get into. And this would be obviously a more advanced type of activity. Yolanda Leon says, I will use it for cultural lessons with my Spanish heritage classes. Yes. And like someone mentioned earlier, nursery rhymes, songs that may have cultural elements are also really good. Songs might, they're difficult to translate, but they bring that awareness of how translation is not just transferring words, but is actually much more complicated, not only because of the structure, but because of the rhythm, the song, the culture, so that this really reinforces not only the cultural element, but also metalinguistic awareness and facilitates comparisons. I think we may have time for one more. I have used a translation activity from English into Portuguese where they had to translate certain sentences which included the present perfect, since in Portuguese it is used differently. The objective was developing metalinguistic and translinguistic awareness. For example, I have already read that book. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do the Portuguese, but I have been sleeping a lot lately. So you can see the two structures right there. So very good. So this one again shows that the objective here is metalinguistic awareness and translinguistic.
There is one quick question in the Q&A that I think could be answered very quickly, which is basically, are there any online classes that are language neutral?
Language neutral.
At the U of A.
By language classes, do you mean translation classes for professionals, or translation or language classes that incorporate translation? Maybe I'll just answer both of them. And
yeah, I think maybe.
Yeah. We do have at the National Center for Interpretation, we have classes for professional interpreters that are language neutral that teach about interpreting, but these are not language classes, they're for interpreters, even though some of that might be quite basic. Then, as far as I know, or the Spanish department is put in the concentration in on Spanish interpreting and translation online pretty soon, but that's also Spanish specific. So other than the courses that I just mentioned that deal with professional interpreting, I'm not aware of any others that are language neutral. So I just wanted to say thank you all for coming, for your time, for your interest. And please, if you have more questions, send them to us. We'll try to do our best. Hopefully it will not be something that we cannot manage. We'll try to answer that questions. Remember that we've given you the link to the ebook where you can find more resources, more examples, more background on this. And I'll leave Sarah with the last word to see if she has anything else to add.
Just thank you everybody for coming. It was great to be here today with all of you, and thank you for all of your wonderful participation and for questions and for filling in the document. And it was, again, really lovely to be here with everybody. So thank you.